The Snowball Showdown is tomorrow. Let's take a look at what some of the best players in the world are going to be bringing to this unique tournament. Now, there are a couple of unique rules for this tournament that do make it a little bit different than actual ladder. The most important of those rules is that you have to be playing at least one card from the last two seasons, so January and December. This restricts deck building in a meaningful way, or I guess it would if one of those cards wasn't Shou-Lao. Now, this is a card that is going to show up a lot, so we're going to split this video into two sections. Section 1, no Shou-Lao. Section 2, yes Shou-Lao. So with that in mind, we're going to start with ELA's build of Thanos. ELA is a player who qualified for Golden Gauntlet Worlds after multiple solid finishes in the Golden Gauntlets that happened beforehand. This is a player who is consistently looking for slightly offbeat ways to attack metagames, someone who was on War Machine type stuff a little bit before a lot of other people were. One of the things that is quite interesting about the change to Sam Wilson is you could argue it's a little bit of a buff with Aurora, because now Sam effectively accounts for 3 Aurora procs, being himself an ongoing and an on reveal, and of course the shield being an ongoing. That means that Aurora is even better with Sam Wilson after his change. And of course he got an extra point, but you also need to actually draw and play him now if you want to get that. The Aurora list is a reasonably powerful and reasonably popular list. People are very familiar with what it's able to do in terms of its output. It is a good output deck that in a tournament like this should run into approximately 0 natural predators like Killmonger. However, the question for me is just purely output. Is this deck able to handle Shou-Lao Scarlet Spider? Is this deck able to handle Shou-Lao Maverick? I really hope that it can, because it's a really interesting build that takes on a really interesting dynamic, and you can see that that specific question is being thought of in this deck. Because you talk about Shou-Lao Scarlet Spider, you talk about Shou-Lao Maverick, and then you look at this deck, and it's like, that's why there's a Super Adaptoid in there. No joke. The only deck I've ever seen that is willing to play that because of what Shou-Lao is doing in the world where people are playing Maverick, in the world where people are playing Scarlet Spider. That's what this card does. Tommy is a player known at high level for weird hybridy discard decks. Famously, he was the pretty much only Black Knight one trick for a very long time at the top of Infinite. Now he has become a bit of a Phantomx one trick, and this is the list that he is bringing. Having played against it on ladder, this is a list that has a lot of power in it, even though you wouldn't expect it to. A lot of what this deck does is just genuinely quite strong, and it operates in a way that I think people are largely unfamiliar with. The problems it has are largely an inability to adapt and a relatively capped amount of total output. When you talk about getting tech cards into this deck, it's very difficult to do because so much of this deck is devoted to making sure what it does happens. It almost adopts a functional combo deck posture because all the cards in here are devoted to your own game plan instead of really interacting with your opponent. This means that a lot of games are going to involve a gambit mattering a lot. That is arguably the most notable thing about playing with and against this deck is that it's a very reasonable, like, here are my points. Yes, I have the obligatory Shadow King, but a lot of what these games come down to is a gambit. It's a very unique deck that requires a lot of understanding, not just of priority dynamics for your Zombie Captain Marvel and, of course, for your Shadow King and your Gambit, but also of generally how you're going to put your entire turns together. Your entire game plan sort of rolls off of itself, which means that this is a deck that's going to reward domain knowledge specifically, which is why I think it's pretty interesting that Tommy is taking it, even though, I mean, like, he is the guy who this deck would reward. It's just, I don't know if anyone having played enough Phantomx, is able to operate a deck like this at full capacity. There honestly is just a lot going on. Gamer is taking C3 Galactus. The idea with this deck is you have the threat of Galactus off of a Cerebroed C3 Maverick Jocasta thing, which means that at any given time, your opponent kind of has to respect the ability for you to drop like an 18 power Galactus on their head. That's a threat that is being leveraged here to allow this deck, as I understand it, to mostly just play like a C3 deck. I expect Galactus to show up not a lot, but what this deck does do is do a very powerful, very relevant C3 thing, and have the threat of Galactus to make it so much harder for your opponent to understand what the hell they're supposed to do on the final turn of the game. This is a dangerous deck for that reason, and Gamer is a player who's going to be really good at using a deck like this. I'm really interested to see how this ends up mattering in the other rule change that is different from this tournament and normal tournaments, which is that cubes are used for scoring, much like my KMBest Holiday Block Party. That is a very interesting dynamic when you have a card like Galactus that is A, such a massive cube juicer, but B, with open deck lists, is entirely known to your opponent. This is the kind of thing that I think will throw a wrench into how people play, and I think that's largely what Gamer is betting on here. I would expect this deck to mostly be C3, but sometimes just the threat of the Galactus means they have to play in suboptimal ways against a deck that frankly already outputs plenty of power. There are Shou-Lao draws that are going to be able to beat you, but they are not nearly so common as people playing Shou-Lao think. Jay Walla taking the classic Cerebro 3 Thanos. This is a list that he actually played to, I believe, a 10th place finish in my KMBest Holiday Block Party, which was basically the same format in terms of Maverick is allowed in this and Maverick is allowed in this too. So this is a deck he's already played in this format. He went, I believe, X1 with it. I think it's a very reasonable choice for someone like him to take. It's an offbeat deck that does weird off-meta things, but mostly what it does is manage to be powerful. I think this is another deck where you look at it and you're like, this can't possibly be good. But what this deck does is twofold. The first thing this deck does is be a good C3 deck. That starts before any of this. But the second thing this deck does is do things like Blue Marvel into a Valkyrie, which is just like sort of unbeatable a lot of the time. And that kind of thing is what really enables this deck. In a world where people are going to be playing Shou-Lao decks and hopefully having priority, you being able to be like, hey, nice giant Maverick thing that you're putting there. Actually, it's 3 power, and also since I have a Blue Marvel, you lose the lane. That kind of dynamic is quite powerful. I am really interested to see how this goes, because when he finished in 10th place in my tournament, Shou-Lao wasn't a card. So I'm interested to see what kind of counterplay this deck has to offer, if it's able to actually manage to do what it did in my tournament in a new, probably higher powered, but less figured out metagame, because the Shou-Lao decks are all different. There's a bunch of different Shou-Lao decks. Not really sure which one of them is going to end up being the best, but you are going to have to contend with that guy, and he is stronger than several of the cards in the last metagame. So I'm really interested to see how this deck manages to sort of port itself into this situation. To nobody's surprise, Danish brought a Hela list, but I don't really think it's fair to call this a Hela list, even though it is one. This is mostly just a ramp deck that is looking to figure out how the hell you're supposed to beat Shou-Lao. And I think that just having a bunch of power is a reasonable way to do it. The problem is the Shou-Lao decks have a lot of power too. It's not so much just Shou-Lao. The thing that really sticks out to me about Shou-Lao is Shou-Lao and then other ways to multiply it. Scarlet Spider, things like Maverick. Those are the things that make this deck a real threat, or make this deck feel a real threat from those decks. A lot of the time you can deal with just a Shou-Lao. It's the other stuff that comes with it that says double this buff, triple this buff. You get it on a Maverick, the Maverick puts it on something else. That kind of stuff, that's really problematic. And so unless people are doing that to you, You do have a lot more points than them. You have the ability to try to go for Goliath on the Shou-Lao if you're going to have priority, which you probably will. A lot of what this deck feels like it's trying to do is do Hela on 6 into Goliath, or Hela on 6 energy, which is actually your turn 5, into Goliath on 7, which is actually your turn 6. And that seems to be like the thing. Like you have priority going into that turn, you Goliath the Shou-Lao. I don't know if it's like a good plan, but I do think that, like, if you're trying to figure out how you're supposed to be a ramp deck in this metagame, this isn't the worst thing you can do. Because the biggest problem that traditional ramp decks have when being faced with Shou-Lao is like, oh, dude, that card's way too big. And if they multiply it and they have their Maverick in the right position, like behind the front line, you as a Cosmic Ghost Rider deck don't have anything for that. So, like, fundamentally, a lot of the matchups between, like, a Maverick or Scarlet Spider or Shou-Lao deck come down to, is it Cosmic Ghost Riderable or not? And if you have half a brain as the Scarlet Spider Maverick player, you just don't let it be Cosmic Ghost Riderable and you win basically every time because you just have more points. That is what's forcing this adaptation. All right, so let's talk about Shou-Lao. He's obviously really, really powerful, but there's quite a diversity of things people want to be doing with him. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's a while before we figure out what the actual broken things with him are. I fully expect that at least one of these decks is going to have something in it that I'm going to describe in a sort of like, oh, this is pretty good way. And then like 3 months from now, I'll be like, are you stupid? This was so obviously broken. I believe that. That's the risk of being a content creator. Anyway, this list is just a stock Shou-Lao list from Sizer. He actually mentioned that he would have rather played Prowler over Deafening Chord. To me, I think Deafening Chord is largely just like a nod to the Mavericks in this sort of generalized metagame. I would expect some of them, but maybe Prowler is just more important so you get more cards. Hard to actually tell. I buy either one in that spot, but fundamentally, this is just stock Shou-Lao. I do want to give a little bit of a shout out to Cable, who in this format can just be like, aha, I have a win condition because I know what they don't have in their deck. These mirrors are so cleanly even a lot of the time between the Shou-Lao decks that just like having a card that exactly 1 out of 12 times just wins the mirror, you're probably just happy with that. Like, the card is fine otherwise. It's a 2/4 that 1 out of 12 times will just win the mirror. You're just happy with that. That's a card you'll play. And I think that that's actually like a dynamic that's worth talking about, because in a world where mirrors are paramount, if we expect a lot of Shou-Lao here, I don't actually have a better idea for mirror tech than that card. Iris and Cougar arrived at the same version of the Batroc list, give or take a Prowler for a Miles Morales. Iris is on the Prowler, Cougar is on the Miles Morales. Now, this is one of those decks that is being done in deference to the deck building rules. They both independently believe that Shou-Lao is not actually the optimal 5 here. They would much prefer to be playing something like Hellion or Thing First Steps. That is the card they want to have in here, but the deck building rules are restricting them. The only way to actually bring a Batroc deck is if you have Shou-Lao be the 5. This is not a great Shou-Lao deck. It is doing nothing special with Shou-Lao. This is just Shou-Lao is a good card, so you can run it here. In other words, this is Shou-Lao's floor. And depending on how high this floor is, we might be able to see what exactly level of problem this guy is. A lot of my fellow high elo players have been talking about how messed up they think this card is or may be. And I think a floor example of how good this card is probably a good way to take a look at that. We have the floor, we have the ceiling. And we're going to talk about the ceiling in just a second. This list, give or take a couple cards, is being taken by a couple of really good players. Browde, Get Wrecked, and Butt. Get Wrecked came up with the original sort of impetus for this. He's been a sort of Dormammu Wolf Truther for a while. Actually, if you remember my KMBest block party, his Dormammu Werewolf deck came in not first place, Jesus. 8th place in my tournament. It was, well, I don't know. Everyone from 5th to 8th is tied. I don't want to be rude, but he came in, he got to the top 8 is what I should say. And I mentioned at the time that I thought it might be a better home for Shou-Lao than the other Werewolfy decks, a lot like Sizer's Werewolfy deck. We had one that was like Sizer's Werewolfy deck and one that was like this. And I thought this might be a better home going forward because of the ways it's easily able to enable extra procs on Shou-Lao. The big adaptation this deck has made is Mercury Professor X. And I believe Derek is on this too, but it might be Cannonball instead of Professor X for him. A lot of this stuff is cool, is interesting, is powerful. I think this deck does a lot for making you really feel like Shou-Lao is doing something messed up. If you're able to back buff a Professor X lane by like 12 points, you win that Professor X lane. And then you sort of look at the other Shou-Lao decks and you're like, okay, well, they can play spells in that lane, so they can move their Werewolf to that lane, so I have to play Mercury. I can't not be a Mercury deck if I'm going to be doing this. I think that's sort of the double-edged sword here, is that you, in order to beat the other Shou-Lao decks, gotta be, if you want to be Professor X deck and beat the other Shou-Lao decks, you have to be a Mercury deck or they're going to wolf you. I think that kind of stuff is an interesting dynamic, but I also think that this is the kind of thing that, like, when you look at a deck, maybe it doesn't beat the mirror perfectly, but this probably beats a lot of other things really badly. Like, this is the kind of thing that takes Shou-Lao and leverages him to a maximal extent in the context of everyone else not playing Shou-Lao. This tournament might not be the right place for it, but I think this one's scary. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe and have a wonderful evening. Also, I got permission to co-stream the Golden Gauntlet tomorrow. Or not the Golden Gauntlet, the Snowball Showdown tomorrow. So I'll be streaming the entire thing on my Twitch channel. I hope to see you there. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you in the next one.